I thought we were happy, but his cruel words shattered everything in an instant. Part 1. The Perfect Illusion. I remember the first time I met Jake like it was yesterday. It was a late summer evening at a small gathering with friends, the kind of night when everything feels effortless and alive. He had this way of standing out, confident, magnetic, the kind of person whose smile pulls you in before you even realize it. I was drawn to him immediately, almost hypnotized by the way he made everyone laugh with just a few words, how his eyes seemed to see right through the surface and into something deeper. We started talking, and before I knew it, weeks turned into months. Jake was everything I thought I wanted: charming, funny, smart. He made me feel special, like I was the only person in the room that mattered. We shared late-night talks about the future, dreams of travel and adventure, and plans for a life we could build together. For the first time in a long time, I believed I had found someone who truly understood me. At first, everything felt perfect. The kind of love story that feels too good to be true, and maybe that was the problem. I was blinded by the illusion of perfection. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. There were subtle signs I didn't want to see. The way he would roll his eyes when I talked about my passions, the small sarcastic comments that left me feeling small and unsure. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at other women, his gaze lingering longer than it should. I pushed those feelings aside, telling myself I was overthinking, that love was supposed to be complicated sometimes. Still, the first real crack came one evening when we were out with his friends for the first time. I was excited but nervous. Meeting the people who were clearly a big part of his life felt like stepping into a new world. His friends were loud and brash, joking in ways that made me uncomfortable, but I smiled through it, trying to fit in. I wanted to be the girlfriend they could accept. We sat around a long table, the dim lighting casting shadows on the walls. The conversation was light at first, funny stories, teasing remarks, until it took a sharp turn toward relationships. One of his friends, a guy with a booming voice and a cocky grin, made a crude joke about women's looks. Everyone laughed, but then Jake added his own comment, and it was like someone slammed the door shut on the whole night. "You know, sometimes I wonder how I even dated her," Jake said, loud enough that everyone could hear. His smile was cruel, eyes cold. "She's kind of ugly, honestly." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt my face flush, heat rising uncontrollably. I wanted to disappear, to crawl under the table and hide. My heart raced and tears welled up, but I refused to let them fall. I looked around desperately, hoping someone would say something, but the laughter died down into awkward silence. His friends exchanged uneasy glances, clearly not wanting to get involved. The worst part was the way Jake kept looking at me, as if daring me to react. Then, without another word, he stood up abruptly and said, "I'm done with this. You're embarrassing me." He walked away, leaving me sitting there, humiliated and shattered. I sat frozen for a moment, my mind spinning with disbelief. How could the person I trusted most treat me like I was nothing? Like I was a joke? I left the restaurant that night with my head held high, even though my heart was breaking inside. I forced myself not to cry in front of strangers, to keep walking even though every step felt heavy. On the way home, I replayed the night over and over, trying to find a reason, a clue, some explanation for how it had gone so wrong. But there was none, just the painful truth. He didn't love me, not the way I thought. In the weeks after, I felt like I was living in a fog. Friends tried to reach out, but I pushed them away, ashamed and angry. I questioned everything, my appearance, my worth, my ability to trust again. But deep down, beneath the hurt, a tiny ember of defiance was burning. I refused to let his cruelty define me. I refused to believe that his words were the final judgment on who I was. I started writing again, pouring my feelings onto paper, raw and unfiltered. It was the only way I could make sense of the chaos inside. Slowly, I began to realize that Jake's words said more about him than about me, that his cruelty was a reflection of his own insecurities and weaknesses, and that I deserved better. This is the beginning of my journey, from humiliation to healing, from heartbreak to self-discovery. I don't know where the road will lead, but I'm ready to find out. Part 2. Picking up the pieces. The days after that humiliating night felt like an endless blur of pain and confusion. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see Jake's sneer, hear the venom in his voice repeating those words over and over. Ugly. They haunted me, cutting deeper than any physical wound ever could. But as raw as the pain was, it also sparked something fierce inside me, a refusal to crumble. At first, I tried to distract myself. I buried myself in work, threw myself into the little routines that once brought me joy. I spent hours cleaning the apartment, organizing everything just so, hoping that somehow the order outside would bring order to the chaos inside. But no matter how much I scrubbed or rearranged, the feeling of emptiness lingered. My friends reached out, the texts, the calls, the invitations, but I was too ashamed to face them. How do you explain that the person you loved could tear you down so publicly, so cruelly? How do you admit that you let yourself be treated like that? I kept saying I was fine, but inside, I was crumbling. One afternoon, I sat on the couch clutching my phone and staring at Jake's last message. A cold, final, "We're done." I remembered all the little lies I told myself. He loves me, he just has a bad day, maybe I'm overreacting, things will get better. Now I saw those lies for what they were, excuses to protect my heart from the truth. I cried, not just a few tears, but a flood, the kind of cry that shakes you to your core and leaves you raw. And in that moment of vulnerability, I made a choice. I would not let Jake's cruelty define me. I would not let his words be the end of my story. I started journaling, writing down every feeling, every memory. I wrote about the first time I saw him smile, the nights we spent dreaming about a future, and the moment everything shattered. Writing was like therapy, painful but necessary. It forced me to face the truth, and slowly, to begin healing. One day, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. Pictures of us laughing, of vacations, quiet mornings sipping coffee together. The contrast between those moments and what had become so sharp, so bitter, was almost unbearable. But it also reminded me that I was more than just this broken relationship. I was someone who had loved deeply and who still had so much life ahead. As the weeks passed, I began to reclaim parts of myself I'd lost. I took up painting again, something I hadn't done in years. The colors and brushstrokes became my escape, a way to express what words couldn't. Slowly, my world grew brighter, piece by piece. Still, the shadow of Jake's betrayal lingered. I had nightmares where he laughed, surrounded by his friends, the words ugly echoing in my ears. I caught myself wondering if I was really as worthless as he said, if maybe I'd been blind to something about myself all along. But then, one night, I looked in the mirror and saw someone who was hurting, yes, but also someone who was fighting to rise above it. I decided to confront those doubts head-on. I wrote a letter, not to Jake, but to myself. You are worthy. You are beautiful in ways he could never understand. His cruelty says nothing about your value. You are enough. That night, for the first time in a long time, I slept without nightmares. The journey was far from over, but I was moving forward, not because I had forgiven him, but because I had forgiven myself for staying as long as I did. Because I was choosing me. I didn't know what the future held, but I was ready to face it, alone if I had to. Because sometimes, the most powerful love story is the one you have with yourself. Part 3. The Mask He Wore. After weeks of struggling to heal, I started paying more attention to the man Jake really was, not the charming boyfriend I'd fallen for, but the person he showed when the masks came off. The cracks I ignored before weren't just small flaws, they were cracks running deep through his character. At first, I'd convinced myself he was just stressed or having a bad day when he snapped or said something hurtful. But the truth was far uglier. The night he called me ugly wasn't an isolated moment. It was the result of a pattern I hadn't dared to face. Jake had always been controlling in subtle ways. The way he dismissed my opinions, mocked my interests, and made decisions without asking me. The way he tried to isolate me from my friends, saying they didn't understand us or that they were bad influences. I thought it was just his way of protecting what we had, but now I saw it for what it was, manipulation. One afternoon, I found myself scrolling through old texts, conversations that seemed innocent at the time but now made me cringe. He'd gaslighted me into doubting myself, turning things around so I felt like I was always the problem. I'd blamed my insecurities on myself when really, they were the result of his constant put-downs and emotional games. I started asking questions, talking to friends who had noticed the changes in me. They told me things I didn't want to hear, that Jake had a temper, that he could be cruel when things didn't go his way. Some even admitted they were relieved to see me out of that relationship. The worst part was realizing how isolated I'd become. The people I thought were my friends had started to distance themselves when they saw how unhappy I was. I had retreated into myself, ashamed and scared to reach out. But slowly, I began rebuilding bridges. I called old friends, apologized for shutting them out, and asked for their support. Some were hesitant at first, but most welcomed me back with open arms. The journey back to trust wasn't easy. I had to relearn how to be honest about my feelings, how to say no without guilt, and how to set boundaries without fear. It felt like learning a new language, one where I was finally the one in control. At work, I threw myself into projects, determined to prove to myself that I was capable and worthy. I even started going to therapy, something I had resisted before. Talking to a professional helped me untangle the mess of emotions inside and gave me tools to cope with the pain. But Jake's shadow still lingered. Every time I saw a couple laughing or holding hands, a pang of jealousy and sadness hit me. I wondered if I'd ever find love again without fear, without doubt. One evening, a message popped up on my phone. From Jake. Just 2 words. "Let's talk." My heart skipped a beat. Part of me wanted to block him immediately, to erase all traces of him from my life. But another part was curious, aching for closure, for answers. I debated for hours, torn between anger and the hope for some kind of resolution. Finally, I replied, "I'm listening." What followed was a conversation I never expected. Him apologizing, blaming his own fears and insecurities, admitting he was wrong. But his words felt hollow, rehearsed, like a mask he was trying on to fix the damage he'd done. I realized then that some people aren't ready to change, that apologies don't erase years of pain, and that healing isn't about him, it's about me. I told him I needed time, space, and that I was moving forward on my own terms. Closing that chapter wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Because sometimes the hardest part of healing is letting go of the person you thought you loved and embracing the person you are becoming. Part 4. Rediscovering me. After closing the door on Jake, I was left with an empty silence, but also, for the first time in months, a flicker of hope. That hope was fragile, like a tiny seed in cracked soil, but it was there. It whispered that maybe, just maybe, I could find myself again. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of rediscovery and painful growth. I started small, taking long walks alone, savoring the quiet moments where my thoughts were uninterrupted. I noticed things I'd stopped paying attention to, the way the sun felt warm on my skin, the scent of fresh coffee brewing in the morning, the rhythm of my own breath. These simple moments grounded me and reminded me that life still held beauty, even after the storm. I returned to hobbies I had abandoned when the relationship consumed me. Painting became a refuge, every brushstroke a release of pent-up emotions. I poured my anger, sadness, and hope onto the canvas. Sometimes the colors were dark and chaotic, other times bright and soothing. Each piece told a part of my story, a visual diary of my healing. Work was both a challenge and a salvation. At first, I struggled to concentrate, my mind drifting back to memories I wanted to forget. But as I pushed through deadlines and meetings, I rediscovered my competence and passion. I realized that my identity wasn't tied to Jake or the pain he caused. I was capable, strong, and deserving of success. Therapy sessions became a cornerstone of my recovery. My therapist helped me untangle the complex web of emotions I'd been trapped in. We talked about boundaries, self-worth, and how to rebuild trust, not just in others, but in myself. I learned to recognize the toxic patterns I'd fallen into and how to break free from them. It was a slow process, but every step forward felt like reclaiming a piece of my soul. Social life was the hardest to rebuild. I felt awkward and vulnerable reaching out to friends I'd pushed away. Some had moved on, busy with their own lives, while others welcomed me back with open arms. We shared laughs, tears, and long conversations that reminded me I wasn't alone. I realized that true friends don't just stand by during good times, they hold your hand through the worst. Love, however, was a distant thought. The wounds Jake left ran deep, and the fear of being hurt again held me back. I avoided dating, telling myself I needed time, but sometimes late at night, loneliness crept in, whispering doubts and second-guessing my resolve. One day, I found myself at a cafe, lost in a book, when a stranger smiled at me. It was a simple gesture, but it warmed something inside. We started talking, first about the book, then about life, hopes and dreams. There was no rush, no pressure, just genuine connection. It reminded me that not all people carry the weight of betrayal and pain. That encounter was a small step, but a meaningful one. It showed me that opening my heart again was possible, that healing wasn't about forgetting the past, but about making space for new beginnings. As I looked in the mirror that evening, I saw more than the woman Jake once called ugly. I saw someone who had endured, survived, and was beginning to thrive. Someone who was reclaiming her story, one day at a time. The road ahead was uncertain, but I was no longer afraid. Because now I knew my worth, and I was ready to build a future that reflected it. Part 5. The Unexpected Turn. The more I healed, the more I realized just how much Jake's betrayal had shaped me. Not just in pain, but in resilience. I thought I was ready to close that chapter completely, but life had its own plans. About 2 months after our final conversation, I ran into Jake. It was at a local bookstore, a place I frequented for peace and escape. I was browsing the shelves when I felt a presence behind me. I turned, and there he was. The same man who had shattered my heart, but now looked smaller somehow, less sure of himself. We exchanged awkward hellos, the silence thick between us. He tried to make small talk, but I could sense the guilt weighing on him. I wasn't sure if it was relief, anger, or curiosity that made me stay and listen. He told me he was struggling too, that losing me had been the wake-up call he needed. He admitted to all the things he'd done wrong, but also spoke about his own pain. A past he'd hidden, insecurities he'd buried deep. For the first time, he showed vulnerability instead of anger or arrogance. Part of me wanted to believe him, to think that maybe he could change. But I also knew better. I had to protect my newfound strength. I told him honestly that while I wished him well, my focus was now on myself, on healing and growth, not reopening old wounds. It was a difficult conversation, but necessary. After he left, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. It was like saying goodbye to a ghost, painful, but freeing. That encounter pushed me to reflect deeper on what I wanted from life and relationships. I realized that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or taking someone back. It meant releasing the hold they had on my heart. I started volunteering at a local support group for people dealing with emotional abuse and heartbreak. Sharing my story helped me find purpose beyond my pain. Hearing others' struggles reminded me that I wasn't alone, and that healing was a journey shared by many. One evening after a session, a woman approached me and said, "Your story gave me hope." That simple sentence hit me harder than I expected. It made me see that my pain had a purpose. It could inspire others to find their own strength. Meanwhile, my creative work flourished. I began preparing for a local art show, planning to display the paintings I'd created throughout my recovery. Each piece was a chapter of my story, raw, honest, and unfiltered. The thought of sharing my vulnerability with strangers terrified me, but also empowered me. As opening night approached, I wrestled with nerves and excitement. What if people judged me? What if they saw only my pain and not my progress? But when the night arrived, something incredible happened. Strangers connected with my art, sharing their own stories and thanking me for my courage. I realized that my pain had transformed into something beautiful, a bridge between broken hearts. Through all this, I felt the weight of the past lighten. Jake's shadow no longer loomed over me. Instead, I stood in the light of my own strength, ready to face whatever came next. Because healing isn't a destination, it's a journey, one step at a time. Part 6. Learning to trust again. The art show had been a turning point, not just creatively, but emotionally. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of something I thought was lost: trust. Not in Jake, but in myself and others. That spark was small but powerful. I had always believed that trust was fragile, something easily broken and almost impossible to rebuild. But now, after everything, I was starting to see it differently. Trust wasn't just about others, it was about believing in my own judgment, my worth, and my right to be treated with respect. Slowly, I began to open up again, not just to strangers admiring my art, but to the people around me. I reconnected with friends who had stood by quietly during my darkest days. Their support reminded me that real connection was possible, It was not perfect, but it was honest. Dating was still a distant thought, but I decided to dip my toes back in the water. I started talking to someone new, someone who seemed genuine, kind, and patient. Unlike Jake, this person listened without judgment and didn't try to control or belittle me. The early days were tentative. I was careful to keep boundaries, to protect myself from falling too fast or expecting too much. But even in the uncertainty, there was a comfort I hadn't felt in years. Companionship that didn't demand my submission, but celebrated my independence. Therapy continued to be a lifeline. Together with my therapist, I explored why I had stayed with Jake as long as I did and how to spot red flags early. It was painful to confront my own blind spots, but necessary to break the cycle. One session, I realized something crucial. Healing wasn't linear. There were days when I felt strong and hopeful, and others when old fears resurfaced, and that was okay. What mattered was that I kept moving forward, even when the path was rocky. At work, I took on new challenges, fueled by a growing confidence. I was no longer the person who needed validation from others. I was becoming someone who trusted her own voice. There were moments, of course, when the past crept back. A song on the radio, a phrase overheard, or a sudden memory. But instead of letting those moments consume me, I learned to acknowledge them and then gently let them go. Friends noticed the change too. They said I seemed lighter, more present. I wasn't perfect. Sometimes I still doubted myself or hesitated, but I was learning to be kind to those parts of me too. One afternoon, I found a note in my mailbox from the new person I was seeing. It was simple. "Take your time, I'm here." Those words were like a balm. They reminded me that trust, once broken, could be rebuilt, slowly, carefully, and with intention. As I looked toward the future, I felt ready to embrace love again, but this time on my own terms, ready to face challenges with courage instead of fear, and most importantly, ready to be whole, not because of someone else, but because of the strength I found within myself. The journey wasn't over, it never would be, but now I walked it with my head held high, my heart open, and my eyes wide with hope. Part 7. Facing the past, embracing the future. By now, I had grown stronger than I ever imagined possible after everything Jake put me through. But strength doesn't mean forgetting or erasing the past. It means facing it head-on and learning from it. And that was exactly what I had to do. One rainy afternoon, a message popped up on my phone. It was from Jake. My heart skipped a beat, but this time it wasn't panic or fear. It was a calm curiosity. I hesitated before opening it, unsure what to expect. The message was brief and surprisingly sincere. "Can we talk? I need closure." I stared at the screen, the weight of 1,000 memories pressing down on me. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend it never happened. But another part, the part that had done so much healing, knew that closure wasn't about him. It was about me. So I agreed to meet. We chose a quiet cafe, neutral ground where we could speak without interruption. When he arrived, he looked different, more humble, more human. The arrogance that once defined him had softened, replaced by a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. We talked for hours. He apologized again, this time with no excuses or defenses. He admitted how much he'd lost, not just me, but respect for himself. And I shared my journey, the pain, the healing, the new life I was building. It was bittersweet. I didn't want to rekindle anything, but I needed to hear it all to truly let go. As we parted, I felt a strange peace. It wasn't forgiveness in the traditional sense, but acceptance. Acceptance that some chapters close for good, making space for new stories to begin. In the weeks that followed, I noticed a shift in myself. I wasn't defined by what happened to me anymore. I was defined by what I chose to become. My relationship with the new person I was seeing grew slowly but surely. We shared hopes, fears, and dreams, building trust one day at a time. There was no rush, no pressure, just a steady rhythm of connection. I also deepened my friendships, realizing that community was as vital to healing as self-love. We laughed, cried, and celebrated life's small victories together. Work continued to challenge and inspire me. I started mentoring a younger colleague, passing on lessons I'd learned about resilience and self-worth. Helping someone else grow was unexpectedly healing. Looking back, I realized that Jake's betrayal had been a devastating blow, but it wasn't the end of my story. It was a painful beginning, the catalyst for transformation, strength, and new possibilities. I wasn't the same person I was before. I was someone wiser, braver, and more compassionate, especially toward myself. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I welcomed it with open arms. Because I knew now that no matter what happened, I had the power to write my own story. Part 8. Reclaiming my life and my heart. Closing this chapter wasn't about revenge or bitterness. It was about reclaiming my life and my heart. After years of being torn apart by betrayal, I finally understood what freedom meant. The morning after that last meeting with Jake, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in a long time. The heaviness in my chest was gone. Instead, there was space, a wide, open space where I could breathe, think, and choose who I wanted to be. I poured my energy into things that nourished my soul: painting, volunteering, spending time with people who lifted me up. Each brushstroke on the canvas was a release of old pain. Each conversation with a friend a reminder that I was loved. Dating continued at a slow, deliberate pace. The man I was seeing wasn't perfect, neither was I. But we respected each other's boundaries, communicated honestly, and grew together. Trust, once fragile, was slowly becoming a foundation for something new. I realized that love wasn't about losing yourself in someone else. It was about sharing your whole self and being accepted. That was a lesson Jake never learned, but I was grateful for the hard way I had discovered it. Work flourished too. I received a promotion, something I never imagined possible when I was drowning in heartbreak. The recognition wasn't just about professional success. It was a testament to how far I'd come. Sometimes I caught myself glancing back, not with longing, but with understanding. That painful past had shaped me, yes, but it didn't define me. I was the author of my story now. One quiet evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, I wrote a letter, not to Jake, but to myself. I thanked myself for the strength, the courage, and the grace to heal. I promised to keep growing, keep loving, and keep believing in the possibility of happiness, even after the darkest storms. Because that's what survival really means, not just enduring pain, but rising above it. As the sun set, casting warm light across the room, I smiled. This was my life, my story, and my truth. And I was finally free,